I love asking people what they enjoy spending their money on. I usually hear a wide range of answers from trying new restaurants to travel to concert tickets, but there are a couple of things I never heard people mention: car payments, gas, insurance, oil changes, parking fees. Owning a car is expensive. The average American spends $11,577 a year on owning and operating a vehicle. And if most households are two cars, that's $20,000 plus dollars a year. Even if I give you the FI discount and assume that you're being resourceful and frugal, there are still a lot of costs that we can't avoid. That's a lot of money going towards something most of us don't feel excited about. So, how could we redirect some of that back into purchases we actually value? Hanna Horvath from Your Brain on Money has an idea. Go car free. I know that probably sounds extreme. Most people can't imagine life without a car, but I challenge you to hear her out. And regardless of where you land, we'll also talk through practical ways to reduce your transportation cost, whether you go car free, car light, or just stick with your current setup. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Hanna Horvath. So we're going to get into car-free living. I'm super interested in what you have going. But for most people that are listening, I think that's a really big leap. What are some other approaches people could take to reduce their transportation costs before going car-free?
The first thing is, like I said, to be clear, I'm not telling anyone in the suburbs to just sell all their cars and buy a unicycle. For most Americans, going car-free isn't necessarily realistic. But there is a big spectrum in between owning two massive SUVs, the latest model, and having no car at all. And so I like to kind of play a little bit in that space. I try to dispel any sort of binary thinking when it comes to money. So ways to reduce your transportation costs. The obvious one is obviously going from two cars to one, which again might not be feasible for everybody, but it is one of the single biggest levers that you can pull. Obviously, as you said in the intro, it reduces your annual costs, thousands of dollars a year. And there is obviously, for especially families, a level of coordination required of that. But it is, like I said, one of the biggest levers you can pull. The second one is to downside the car you already have. And a lot of times owning a car for us is very much wrapped up in our identity and emotional and all of that stuff. And so there's often a gap between the car that we need and the car that we actually use. And so kind of reevaluating, do I actually need a car that is this big, or a car that is this expensive, or is a gas guzzler, whatever it is, and just kind of rethinking kind of how that looks. Other smaller strategies is, adding an e-bike. A lot of the trips that we take are under 3 miles. That's a great option for an e-bike. As someone that regularly rides e-bikes, they're fairly easy to maneuver. They're not a ton of effort. You have the pedal assist and all of that. And that can save you an operating cost for your car because you're using your car less. Of course, buying an e-bike costs money up front, but it usually pays for itself pretty quickly. The other two things are just using the car you have less. I know this sounds a little obvious, but it is actually quite underrated. I think especially in very car-dependent areas, there's a tendency to just, let's just get in the car and drive. But of course, driving less reduces gas, maintenance, all of that stuff. Maybe you can batch your errands. Maybe, you can walk for anything under a mile or whatever that distance is. And again, these are small behavioral changes that do compound over time, and they kind of add a layer of friction that I really recommend when it especially comes to spending. I think when you're in a car, it makes it a lot easier to just run to Target and grab a few things, and the next thing you know, you're spending all this money. And switching from doing that, for example, to walking, there's only so much you can carry. And so again, it's adding friction, and all of that helps your financial life. And then the last thing I recommend is to audit your insurance. Insurance premiums have risen pretty drastically over the past couple years. And so I'm not necessarily recommending getting less coverage because, that can obviously hurt you if something were to happen, but just looking for things like maybe low mileage discounts. If you feel like you have a solid emergency fund, raising your deductible, even bundling policies, there's little tips and tricks you can kind of do around that. But those are kind of the main things I recommend for people.
Yeah, on the insurance piece, that was something I've done recently, is just increasing my deductible. As I become more financially independent, I can take on a little bit more risk. And when I had $500 deductibles, raising it to $1,000 was saving me $160 a year. Hopefully, that's going to be a wash as long as I'm not getting into an accident every less than 3 to 4 years.
Yeah.
Plus, I'm probably not filing a claim if it's in the $500 to $1,000 range anyway.
Yeah. And there's actually been statistics that home insurance claims and auto insurance claim denials are going up. There's even a fair chance that if you were to file a claim, there's a higher chance now that it can get rejected. So it kind of just builds the case for just having more of that padding on your own and kind of like bolstering self-insuring with kind of a higher deductible.
I think the best approach that you offered there, though, is just right sizing your car situation. I think many of us don't realize that we don't necessarily need two or even three cars in like a two-driver household, that we can maybe get away with one car. My wife and I are really interested in trying that experiment at some point in time. I thought we were going to. Her car was giving her some trouble. It's like leaking fluid right now, and we're just filling it up. And we're like, man, we might go down to one car. But I think it'd be okay. Most of the time, we're not needing cars at the exact same time. And we were like doing some of the math and like, okay, even if once or twice a month we both need access to the car, she hates driving anyway. So she would prefer to just get into an Uber or take public transportation and get to where she's going versus having to drive on her own. And I'm like, what would be the difference between maybe two Ubers a year or a month versus like owning a car just alone with the maintenance, the insurance, even if we're not driving it on top of the gas? Like, I still think we're going to break even, if not actually save money in this situation.
Yeah, and with gas prices right now, I mean, it's an enormous, enormous cost. And I think for a lot of people, because in America, the car is the default. It's the default mode of transportation. So when you are thinking about going from point A to point B, your brain is just naturally going to getting in a car. And so potentially downsizing or reconfiguring your schedule away from getting in a car, it does take a little bit of compromise and maneuvering, you know? And so I think when people think about downsizing or going from two cars to one or three cars to two, they think, oh, can we survive with one less car? But the question should really be, what do we need to change to make this work? Because there will be a change. You're not going to be able to live the exact same life with just one less car a lot of the times. So
Yeah.
like you said, maybe it is coordinating your schedules a little bit more. Maybe it's one person taking transit or biking. You know, maybe it's kind of seeing if you can do some sort of remote work negotiation. And like you pointed out, a lot of times taking Uber once or twice a month for those absolutely necessary situations, it really does not add up as much as you think it's going to add up. And again, like I was saying earlier, the whole kind of point of this too is not only are you spending less on maintenance and gas and all this stuff, but you're also adding more friction into your life. And when it comes to your spending, that actually can be a really good thing. So I think cars kind of add to this general environment that we're in around like consumption and buying lots of things. I think the car helps aid that. And so I think actually rethinking your relationship with the car actually is rethinking your relationship with consumerism and frictionlessness.
Yeah, I want to hear more about that because honestly, I mean, that's one interesting part too. And the other part is like this community is so intentional with how they spend their time and energy. And owning a car, I have realized this. I'm a 3-car household, unfortunately. We have a beater van that we just use for like furniture flipping. And it has given me so much trouble. Actually, the door just locked on me the other day, and I'm going to have to go probably spend a couple of hours like reconnecting the cable in the car. And I'm like, man, the amount of time that I've dealt with just in the last couple of years, a parking ticket, my van got broken into, so a busted window, an oil change that went wrong that turned into like $1,600 fee. Like, I'm like, ugh, I'm so over this because not only is it draining on cost, but it's kind of draining on my time and energy too.
Totally. And again, I think because it is seen as a default for a lot of people, they don't realize that they don't maybe necessarily need to be paying these costs or dealing with these things. And as I'm sure your audience knows, there is like an opportunity cost of time that comes with a lot of these things. It's really not just the money. It's like the effort and time that you have to spend dealing with the issue or dealing with the issue yourself. I'm a big proponent of reevaluating your relationship to the things that you're spending money on at all times, you know, just constantly reevaluating it. And I think the car kind of gets pushed off to the side because it's seen as like, oh, well, we just have to have this. We have no other option. I try to look at it as thinking of like, well, is this actually bringing you joy? Because again, I'm not necessarily saying every single person should live a car-free life. That might not work for some people. And also some people genuinely enjoy driving. They enjoy doing the repairs of the car, fixing up an old car. And so for those people, that's great. It seems like you're spending your time and your money in a place where you want to be doing it. But for a lot of people, that's not the case. You know, I haven't had a car in years and years because I live in New York City. But when I had a car, like if something happened to it, it's like, oh my God, it was like the worst thing in the world for me because I didn't want to have to deal with it. Like I wasn't enjoying that. So it was a good sign for me of like, oh, this is something I really don't want to be spending my time and energy on. And so how can I reallocate my budget or reallocate my life in a way that I'm spending as much of my money on things that genuinely make me happy and bring me joy?
Yeah, I love in your blog and your newsletter how much you hit that every single time is like just always evaluating what you value spending your money on. I think that's super important. And, the car is almost similar to owning a home for me, where I see some of my friends that own a home and it's like, A, they probably bought a little too much home, just like many of us buy a little too much car. And then I see how much money they sink into and how much time they sink into keeping up with their home, repairing their home. And it just makes me a little turned off from ever wanting to be a homeowner. Like the idea of being a homeowner sounds great. And then I look at my homeowner friends and they're like, kind of just wish I had an apartment in the city.
And if anything, I think cars are worse because they depreciate. So it's like
Yeah.
this whole other thing. But yes, it is so interesting in that I think like a house, a car, there's so much cultural conditioning around it where it's like, this is this thing you need to do, or this is this thing that everyone's doing. And especially with a home, it's like seen as this almost milestone of like, and same with the car, like buying your first car, buying your first home. And for a lot of people, again, it's like I like to examine whose life are you really living? Or are you just like trying to follow what you see other people are doing that looks like it's the quote unquote right thing to do? Or is this something you genuinely want and makes sense for your life? And it comes down to understanding what you actually value, because money is a tool to help you live the life you want to live. And so I'm someone that really values flexibility and optionality, the ability to travel. I'm sure a lot of other listeners kind of feel the same way. I would argue, and I'm not saying this a blanket statement, but I would argue those values are kind of at odds with owning a home.
Yeah.
So examining that kind of stuff is really important when it comes to making these really big purchases, and also just being aware of how, social comparison and all of these external influences are shaping how you think about cars. I mean, we're getting inundated constantly with ads about cars. A lot of car ads like prey on fear, like you need to have the latest and greatest like safety feature or whatever to protect your family. And it's led to why cars are getting so big in America. A lot of it has to do with that. And it's the same thing with homes, but it's really important to examine like, am I being told about what kind of car I should have, or if I should have a car, and is this actually right for me, and does it actually make sense for me?
For most people, like not having a car is just out of the picture because they live 20, 30, 40, an hour plus away from where they work.
Yeah.
They're in the suburbs and they have to come into the city to work. But I found this idea that you talked about with combining your housing and transportation cost really fascinating, and how that might show how walkable areas are actually more affordable than they seem. Can you break that down for us?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So I think when people think about if an area is affordable, they're thinking about it in terms of typically median home price. And they're not often thinking about it in other things that are also harder to quantify, like quality of life. And one way that I've found that actually helps you understand if an area is affordable or good for you or not is combining housing and transportation costs. So again, like the traditional rule of thumb, let's say it's like housing is affordable if it's like 30% or less of your income. And by measure, like I think it's like 50 or 60% of households kind of qualify for that. And as I talk about in my newsletter, there's this additional index that adds in those transportation costs. And when you set a benchmark of 45%, so your housing and your transportation, the number of affordable neighborhoods drops significantly. So that signals to me that a lot of people are living in what they think are these affordable areas, but they're actually paying significant amounts in transportation costs because they're commuting so much, et cetera. And I think that's really big for any type of financial planning, but especially FI planning, because we like to anchor ourselves to numbers. So, you see a house that's affordable and maybe it's an hour away from your work. But by the time you add in the second car, the gas, the insurance, the maintenance, your total cost of living might be higher than if you had lived closer to the city center or more in a more walkable neighborhood where you only needed one car. And yeah, there might be higher rent or higher home prices, but much lower or potentially zero car costs. And the other like psychological piece I want to point out about this, and I'll bring in a personal example, which is, as I said before, I live in New York. It's a very expensive city. I don't necessarily think I'm saving on costs. I mean, I am saving in the fact that I don't have a car, but I am living in an unbelievably expensive city. However, I do think there's a psychological cost of my quality of life is significantly better for me than if I lived outside of the city in a more car-dependent area. And so I think it's worth exploring for people, not only combining housing and transportation to understand if an area is affordable, but think through, how do I live my life? What do I like to do outside of work? And think about how the neighborhood and place around you can help support that. Because again, I think it's very easy for us to focus on just the numbers of it all, but thinking through again, like what's actually important to you, how do you want to spend your days, and where I live and how far away it is, all of that factors into it. And so I would argue, again, it's like opportunity cost. I would argue that is another, thing to think about when you're kind of thinking about where to live and all of that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And maybe it's dependent on where you're at in your FI journey right now. If you're at the beginning and it really makes sense for you to save a little bit of money by moving a little bit further out, then go for it. But I do think we should probably put some more weight into quality of life as we get a little bit further along in our FI journey. I mean, ideally, you're always considering that and all of it. Sometimes it's impractical to think through it. But I love the illustration that you're painting here, where it might cost you $3,000 to rent a place near where you work in the city center, or $2,500 20 or 30 minutes outside the city. So you'd be saving $500 if you just looked at it apples to apples on rent. But you layer in what it's going to cost to drive into work, to park for your job, to pay for gas, to do extra maintenance, to maybe even own a car, you might be adding on that additional $500. So at the end of the day, it might actually be $3,000 to $3,000 when you combine these costs together.
And this is a really good example. This is like textbook mental accounting, right? Where we kind of put our money in different buckets and weight them differently. Like we mentally separate them. And the reason we do this, especially with housing and transportation, is housing costs are typically more fixed. Transportation costs are a lot more variable. And so our brain processes these two different numbers differently, when I would argue functionally they're part of the same decision, which is how much does it cost me to live my life where I live? And I think you actually brought up a really good point about people at the beginning of their FI journey and saving costs that way, where, again, it comes down to values and priorities. And so someone at the beginning of their journey, if their like absolute priority and absolute focus is I want to save as much money as possible to get my journey started, that's a good sign that that is where your energy and money and savings should go. And so then, yeah, maybe you should live further out to kind of cut costs and stuff like that. But again, that just goes to show it really comes down to what is most important to you. For me personally, I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit of the money I could potentially be saving to live in an area where, I can walk around or take public transportation and really access all the things I want to access more easily that way.
So when I travel to Europe and Asia, I'm often reminded that there are like millions of people that get to where they need to go without owning a car. How did the US get here? Or probably even more interesting, why are we still designing car-centric cities?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the example I always like to start with is you think of Disney World, which people call the happiest place on earth. And that's a walkable city.
Yeah.
There are no cars. And I think that plays a really big role in why people like Disney World so much. The ability to walk around and be in community with other people and just interact with the world around them without worrying about getting hit by a car or just like the exhaust and like, all of that stuff. So I like to start with that because I think people are like, oh, I don't know why I'm having so much fun in Europe. It's so amazing. I'm like, you're in a walkable city. I mean, that's part of the reason why. I'll start by saying what makes the United States different than Europe is it's huge. Obviously, Europe is part of the EU, but like as a single country, the United States is giant. So there is a level of like just being able to need to get around. But 100 years ago, a lot of major American cities had streetcar networks, public transportation. You could get places without a car, especially because cars at that time were very expensive. So they were only accessible for a certain amount of people. And then in kind of the 1930s and 40s, just brief history lesson, a bunch of companies like GM and Standard Oil, they came together to buy up a bunch of the streetcar services, degrade them, and then start selling their cars as like the solution to the problem. And what essentially has happened, starting in kind of the 1950s and on, there's been a couple things. One, the cultural embrace of the car as part of the American identity, where it's seen as this thing of freedom, of independence, which is wrapped up in American ideals and like what it means to be American. And then also this was aided by policy with like the Federal Aid Highway Act, which vastly expanded all the highways in the United States. And all of those things together made it possible and then eventually required for a lot of Americans to have cars. Also, on top of this, we live in a country, we're a bunch of different states. We all have our different policies, but most states have zoning laws that have things like single family zoning, minimum parking requirements, low density development. And all of these policies make it very difficult or even impossible to live without a car in most of America. And that's why almost half of Americans do not have any access to public transit. And even the people that do have access to public transit, a lot of times it's unreliable, it's infrequent, so it's not that usable for like the vast majority of people. And so essentially our entire system in America, which is both propped up by car companies and also supported actively by policies, is designed to make car ownership mandatory because it makes a ton of money for both the companies and the states and, federal government through tolls and taxes and things like that.
That's unfortunate. And like the Disney World example just paints it so perfectly. Even here in Austin, like they'll shut down 6th Street one night and it's like the best thing ever because we all get to walk across the street, bounce around the different bars and stuff. Like how many festivals happen where they like shut down a street and it's like the coolest thing ever. Like,
Yeah.
sometimes I like to daydream what the world would look like without cars. It's just
Yeah.
so fun to think about.
I know. The two experiments I like people to kind of run in their heads is if you live in an area that's truly car dependent, I would, if it's safe to do so, go on a walk. Like if you're going to run like a single area and it's maybe a mile or mile and a half away, walk there if you can and just see a lot of times how poor the pedestrian infrastructure is. And it really gives you a visual sense of just where the priorities lie in terms of like designing our environment for the pedestrian versus the person. The other thing I love to do is when I'm walking down the street, I'll see how many cars are kind of in the street versus pedestrians. And you'll notice, especially in like a place like New York, you'll have all these pedestrians crammed in like a 20-foot sidewalk. And then you'll have maybe 5 or 6 cars in the street. And you can safely assume there's like one person in each car. So we're giving 50 feet, so much space for these 6 people because they're in cars, and everybody else is crammed on the sidewalk. And so I think it's a really good example of showing how we have designed our space to be adaptable and amenable to cars instead of pedestrians. And whether we realize it or not, the place that we live has an enormous impact on our sense of self, but also our money and how we want to spend money and what we're influenced by. And that's very much propped up by policies and the way that things are designed and like our built environment. Living in a place where things are designed for cars, it's going to push you in a certain direction in terms of how you're thinking about cars and how you want to spend money. And as I was saying earlier, the car helps aid a lot of the consumerism that we see in our society because it makes it a lot less friction for us to go buying and shopping and things like that.
My hope is I don't know if Waymo or another self-driving car company has taken over New York City yet, but it has here in Austin.
Yeah.
I'm actually pretty hopeful on that because I do think that will give more flexibility. If we start moving towards self-driving cars and people are more adept to using it, then having parking garages right next to concert venues or sporting venues or having parking spaces right out in front of the restaurant you go to, some of that will hopefully be redirected to a different area if cars are just dropping people off and then driving, and hopefully they're going to a parking garage 20 minutes outside the city versus us having to do that, keep our car there all day long. Because like I go through some of these cities and how much of the city is just given towards the asphalt to drive on, the parking garages are parking lots to park on. Like it's a bummer how much space is just given towards the priority of cars.
I know. And the vast majority of a car's life has no one in it. It's just parked. It's quite remarkable of just how much space we give the cars. Another example I'll give with New York, but I know other cities have done it too, is like during the pandemic, they rolled out like outdoor dining. So you would have these like lovely, I mean, at least in New York, you'd have these lovely sheds that were well designed and like people were sitting on the street and it was just like lovely. And then, they got rid of them so 2 cars could park there. I mean, it was like, it was ridiculous and it was really sad. And like, you can really see, and the other thing that we haven't touched on yet is like cars make people lonely.
Yeah,
and it adds to like the loneliness epidemic. And also it makes people, we're already in a situation where we trust each other less for a variety of reasons. And I think cars help aid that. There's something that happens when you're inside a car. You don't always see, they call it car brain. You don't interact with the world in the same way. So that's how road rage happens. And that adds into like the sense of like everyone's out to get me. That's why people do things that they would never do to someone's face, but they'll do it in a car because it's psychologically a different experience for a lot of people. So not only are there like true financial costs, there's also like psychological costs, emotional costs, and like social costs for all of us. So even if you yourself don't drive a car or, you do, but you are thinking about giving it up, we all are affected by this, whether we want to be or not.
An article you wrote about this, you quoted, "Cars privatize what used to be public space and shared experience. You go from an isolated home to an isolated car to an isolated destination, typically work. This contributes to loneliness, weakened community bonds, and political polarization. When you never physically share space with people outside your chosen bubble, it's easier to see them as abstract threats rather than neighbors.
Yeah,
So true.
I know. I mean, I think about this, how what a solitary existence sometimes being in a car is, because a lot of times you're the only one in it. I also think cars lead to the loss of spontaneity, which I think is such a beautiful part of being alive and being in a community. And don't get me wrong, I mean, we talk a lot about the loneliness epidemic and like the need to build community. Building community can be extremely frustrating and time consuming and complicated, because you're putting yourself out there, you're interacting with other people, you're not going to agree with everybody. You're getting exposed to ideas and things like that you might not agree with. But the point is, you're better understanding the world around you. You're building more empathy for the people around you. And when you don't have that constant contact with your neighbors, you don't have that empathy that I think you naturally kind of build when you're constantly around other people. And like you quote in my newsletter, it's contributing to these larger societal issues that we're seeing. And I do think that if we got out of our cars, when we can, and went out into our community and like interacted with other people, I think that could be a beautiful thing. I mean, my favorite thing about living in New York is the serendipity and possibility of being able to run into a friend on the street or run into a stranger on the street and like have a lovely conversation. And like people tend to call them like New York moments, but it's really just spontaneity and what happens when everybody is not in a car and they're outside on the street or on public transportation. And when everybody, doesn't matter income bracket, age, et cetera, when we're all using the same infrastructure, like public transportation, the government invests in it. When we're all using it, there's more likelihood to invest in that infrastructure. And so that's why it's great when we have that environment. But for a lot of people, not everyone's using public transportation or whatever. And so there's less investment in it for that reason. It's kind of like chicken or the egg situation.
Yeah, my wife used to live in New York City, and it was so fun just like walking out of a subway and walking down the street, and we were like, what should we have for dinner? And then we walk by like a restaurant. It smells really great. The music is vibey, and we walk in there and we sit at the bar because we don't have a reservation. Then we start chatting with the people right next to us, and we make friends. Then we go bar hop with them to another spot. Like that serendipity that you're mentioning does not happen when you get in your car, you sit in traffic, you finally get to your driveway, you decompress in the driveway for 10 minutes, you walk inside, and then you do whatever you actually plan to do. Yeah,
and actually, it's interesting to bring that up because I write a lot about consumer culture. And consumer culture actually really benefits from the loneliness epidemic because when you are exhausted and stressed and overwhelmed and lonely, you're actually easier to be sold to. So a lot of consumers that are, maybe you're driving home, you're exhausted, because being in a car is also exhausting, especially if you're driving a long distance.
Yes.
You're decompressing, you're going home, you're like, I don't have the brain power to like do anything right now. Maybe you're scrolling on your phone. Maybe you're getting targeted ads. Next thing you know, because the whole infrastructure is so frictionless, you're buying something online. And, like I said, I live in a very expensive city. And I think there's this natural, like, oh, you're probably spending all this money. There are so many free activities to do here. I mean, it is fairly easy to live a fairly free activity life. And so because I'm out in the world, I'm less likely to get tempted by kind of the ads and gamification, all this stuff on my phone. So I think it's like, again, it all comes down to this like trade-offs where I think people, again, tend to anchor on the numbers. Where it's like, oh, New York City, the rent is so expensive, which, to be clear, it is. But, there's a trade-off there where, like, maybe, again, I'm spending less money on transportation. Maybe I'm, not spending as much time on my phone. Or, like, again, it all comes down to kind of values and what you want to get out of life.
And I think the one big other benefit that we haven't mentioned yet, I mean, of course, we're going to save a lot of cost. I love that we're building community and fighting loneliness, which is a huge problem in the FI community, probably in all communities, but I hear it very often in the financial independence community, how we probably neglected friends for decades trying to save and get to this goal, but also is our health. This is usually a big priority. There's a lot of type A in the FI community. So after we've reached FI, usually the next big thing is like, how do we start optimizing our health? And just getting out and not sitting in a car for hours and having to walk. Like I was always surprised when I went and visited my wife, and I would like easily rack up 10,000 steps a day, just like bopping in and out of subways, because you got to walk half mile and then you sit and then you walk a quarter mile and then you walk another half mile. It's such a nice experience.
I know. Because for me, it's like at this point, I don't even think about the 10,000 steps because I'm naturally hitting it every day in the way that I'm living my life, and you're not even thinking about it. I think that's kind of the point of like, it's also cognitively stressful to have to like hold all these metrics in your head. And if your life is naturally built around that, it's great. And, there's been times I'll go on work trips or to a more car dependent area, and I'm like barely cracking 3,000. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like it really, and again, I definitely don't want this to come across as like I'm blaming anybody, because it's the way that your environment is set up. I mean, it just makes it so difficult for you to move around. Like if you want to run an errand, if you want to grab a coffee, I mean, a lot of times it requires you getting in a car because there's nothing that's walkable. So yeah, I mean, I think when people think about health, especially because we're in a culture that is so built around optimization, and especially for people that are doing FI, because your brain is naturally going to that optimization route because that's what you're doing with your money, there's a tendency to anchor yourself to like these metrics, right? Of, maybe even Oura rings with like your sleep score and your steps and all of that stuff. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, but I do think that there is a world kind of beyond the numbers. If you think about, I don't know if you've heard about like blue zones in America where, the average person is living to around 100. And so, there's been studies on kind of what the longevity thing is there. And I'm sure part of it is genetic, but if you look at the cultures of those people, they're drinking, they're sitting in the sun, but the kind of dominant theme is they're hanging out with each other. They're in community with each other. They're not sitting behind the wheel of a car. They're walking around. And so I think that is just a sign that, maybe there's something to be learned there about being in community with people, especially as you kind of, I think it's easier to accomplish that when you're in your 20s and even 30s. But then as you start to get older, it's important to kind of continue to remember that of how do I have community? Is it accessible to me? Because I think that ends up being a huge part of people's life, or maybe it's the lack of it is a huge part of someone's life. And it's, again, really hard to quantify. Like it's very easy to quantify how much sleep you got if you're wearing a tracker, but it's harder to quantify the quality of your friendships that you have with people. So it's something definitely worth thinking about.
This conversation definitely made me think about a lot of things. And I love the blue zone. The thing that I always hear around longevity is typically daily movement and a sense of community and surrounding yourself with community. And it seems like being less dependent on a car is going to aid in both of those situations. And I think you brought to light not just pursuing a car-free life, but I think there are versions or options that might be in between where you're at right now and car-free. It could be dropping one car. Could be downsizing your car. It could just be using your car a little bit less. I loved your idea around just negotiating work from home. Or if you're barista-fi or coast-fi and you have some flexibility with your partner to share a car because the work schedules are not dependent. I think there's so many options here. And I think the FI community is really set up to dive into some of those options to be less dependent on cars, of course, save some money, become healthy, and have a strong sense of community because of it. So, Hanna, this was a really great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on. If people were to check out your blog, Your Brain on Money, what would they expect or what would they get from consuming it?
Yeah. So again, thank you so much for having me on. My newsletter explores the psychology of money. So I look at kind of three different things. I look at kind of these structural forces that shape what we think about money. And a big one, like I said before, is your neighborhood, where you live, your built environment. I look at social forces, how social comparison shapes how we think about money. And then, of course, the internal stuff, how money is wrapped up in our identity, the cognitive biases that make it hard for us to, save and spend and all that, though I'm sure the FI community doesn't have an issue with saving. I publish twice a week, and it's a great time. And I also definitely write about cars if and when I can, because it's a huge, anti-cars is a huge passion of mine. But yeah, like I said, I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, and that's on Substack, correct?
Yes, it is.
Cool. I'll have a link in the show notes for anyone that's interested. Once again, Hanna Horvath from Your Brain on Money. Hanna, thanks so much for joining me on FI Minded.
Thank you. Thank you.